Hey, Tom here from growfoodwell.com, and today we're going to talk about these seedlings here and what's in the mix that's growing these seedlings in such a healthy manner. And I wanted to talk briefly about the difference between a sterile soil medium or a sterile growth medium for seedlings versus living soil, which is what we have here, and what the difference is between the two. Now, you may have heard some people swear by the fact that you cannot grow seedlings in anything that has garden soil or compost in it because you can get damping off, you can get mold spores, mildew, all kinds of things can come in and attack the seedlings. Now, that is partially true, and in many cases happens. I've had damping off before over the years. Occasionally it happens. But I wanted to show you the reasons why those two, the choice in that matter exists. Now, in the one case of sterile growth medium for seedlings, if you are, say, a commercial operation selling seedlings in a big box store, a nursery, you probably want to use a sterile medium to have universal, consistent growth with no disease whatsoever, so you can get those things out the door and have a small plant develop and allow people to purchase it and it looks healthy. You may have to feed it a little bit of fertilizer to get it to this stage, not just to the first true leaf, but actually to this kind of growth is going to require some outside influence because there's not quite enough energy in the seed itself to get to this level of development. It'll come up above the soil and get its first true leaves or a few sets of leaves, but these are well on their way to further growth. So you need, in the case of the sterile medium, something to kick it along. And typically in the commercial settings, they will feed it some fertilizer to make them grow fast and get out the door. Now, that side of the equation can avoid most diseases. So that can work for growing in a sterile medium, especially in a commercial setting, and it makes total sense. But what those plants don't have going for them is the sterile medium is not creating any relationships with microorganisms in the soil. It's just having the plant wait for more food from the fertilizer itself. And there's nothing biologically going on in that soil outside of the plant trying to grab nutrients on its own through that fertilizer. What's happening here, and I wanted to give you an example of the other side of the equation, are a lot of seedlings that are growing in living soil. Now there's about 450 some odd plants under these lights right here, and these are just standard LED shop lights at 7,000 lumens. They do a really good job. They're low energy, so they're super efficient. They don't get hot, and they're just about the right light level to get these seedlings really jumping. But more importantly, these seedlings are planted in soil blocks with living soil. And those of you that are in the class already know all about the soil blocks and the recipe there. But this year I substituted the compost portion, which is a living compost from on-site. Instead, I put in worm castings, or the compost from the worm bin that's mostly worm castings, in that recipe. And what I've got here is a really good example of robust growth from seedlings that are about as healthy as you can expect from a seedling at this point. This is about 5 weeks out, more or less. I've got 10-inch tall, wonderfully developed tomato plants. I've got about 85 of those. These are 9 and 10 inches tall, and they're all doing quite well. You can see how well their structure is happening. These aren't weak tomatoes that are limp and falling over. These are very strong stems, and they're doing quite well. This is called deer tongue leaf lettuce. It's a wonderful, really good grower out here, and it's doing quite well. And I've got some oak leaf lettuce on the end there. But this is the kind of growth you're looking for in seedlings, and you can tell these are just about overgrowing their trays, so I have to get them out pretty soon here. I've got kale and collards. I've got red cabbage here, some more kale, basil plants that are doing really well, lots of different types of lettuce. And I'll be using those for transitional planting to kind of jump ahead so that when I do plant seeds out in the next couple weeks, these plants will already have a jump start on the rest of them that'll be coming in after them. So it's successional planting so that I have a longer period of time where the food comes to fruition and you can kind of pick as you go. And some of these, like the cabbage, need a longer growing season than we can provide outside, so I have to start them early. Same with tomatoes, of course. In Colorado, where we are, we have about 130-day growing season, so these tomatoes need a little advanced growth before they go out into the soil. But one of the biggest things about the difference between a sterile medium and a living soil medium is what you're doing to these plants early on, in this case, is giving them a chance to have relationships with microbiology in the soil, with living organisms in the soil that are there for nutrient cycling and the positive feedback loops that happen with these relationships. Now, these plants already have a great experience working with the soil food web. They are interacting with all these microorganisms in the soil doing nutrient cycling to help feed themselves. So that's what you want in these plants, because by the time we transplant them out, they will already be well versed in how to interact with all these organisms to get their food. And as we put these plants into living soil, it's just more of the same for them. And they will just explode outward with their roots, and all the microorganisms that are already surrounding their roots and protecting them and feeding them will bloom into the surrounding soil and mix with all the other microbiology, and that system will just continue the growth that you're seeing here. And that's the really key process here. Is many of you have probably experienced transplant shock. When you take a seedling that you purchased at the big box store or some nursery, you put it in your soil and it just sits there for 2, sometimes 3 weeks and doesn't seem to do anything. Now what's happening is it's going through a shock period, temperature change most likely. It depends if these seedlings have been hardened off and if they're used to the temperature swings in your particular microclimate. They're also being introduced to living soil. Hopefully you have some living soil with a lot of microbiology in it. So they're in shock, trying to adjust to that whole new system. And what's really important about that is when a plant goes into crisis or stress or shock of any kind, it weakens. It's interrupted. Its growth cycle is interrupted. And right there is when pests and disease are specialized to find that weakness and come in and hurt that plant. So when you have a strong plant that's already well versed in the whole process of the real world outside and you transplant it out, they have a far less difficult time going through that transition as you're transitioning to the larger beds outside. So these plants will have a much stronger reaction to ward off pests and disease during that very precarious time during transplanting. And that's why I do this. I've done this for 20 years now, and it works really well. So I wanted to show you a couple things. A lot of these plants are going out in the next few days because we're approaching our frost date, and they can safely be taken out. And some of these could have gone out a week ago, like the lettuce and other freeze-tolerant plants here. But what's really fun is seeing the actual growth and the health of these seedlings. Here's some basil plants. These are 5 weeks old. And here, I'll bring it up to the camera so you can see. That is a pretty healthy flat of seedlings. Now this, can you smell that basil? I bet you can. It smells so good. So these basil plants are really raring to go. Let me give you an example of some, here's some red cabbage that's getting ready to go out. So we have really good leaf structure. We have really strong stems. Everything is about as robust and healthy as you could expect a plant to be after 5 weeks. And that is all, in my case, in this particular example, is due to the living soil and what's in those soil blocks. And the fact that it's getting adequate light at the right level. The soil blocks are allowing them to feed without being root bound. Here, I'll pull a tomato out here, bring that up to you. So you can see the soil block allows that root to actually go beyond the soil block and reach for water and nutrients around it. And what's happening is it's developing its intricate root system, but it's not being root bound. It doesn't circle back like in the plastic cells. When you plant them in cells, you'll end up with a root bound plant. And this one is not. It'll come out, and many of these micro roots will come out to the air at the edge of the block, and they'll stop. They won't dry out because there's still water in the block. But as soon as you transplant that into the soil, they'll just run straight out into the soil. So I have tons of roots around the entire block that are ready to spread out as soon as they go in the soil. That continues this growth cycle and keeps this plant out of stress. So that's one of the best reasons to have soil blocks. And the second reason to have soil blocks with living soil is due to this relationship with the soil food web. And so today, real quick, I wanted to show you, I'm going to put this under the microscope for you in a second, and I'm just going to take a small piece of soil off of one of the soil blocks here in this red cabbage, that little dot right there. So I'm going to put a dropper of water on there and get it in solution, and we're going to put it under the microscope and we're going to see what's in there. So what you're seeing on that slide are millions and millions of microorganisms that are breaking down organic matter and doing nutrient cycling and mineral cycling to help provide plant available nutrients. And the plants are releasing their exudates into this surrounding soil to feed these microorganisms in a symbiotic relationship. That's what is going to happen when they go into the garden as well, when they start feeding off of the soil food web. So keep this in mind when someone tells you you have to grow in a sterile medium. None of these are growing in a sterile medium. They're doing as well as anything could. You can't really get this kind of growth unless you pump it full of synthetic fertilizers, and then they're not getting this natural relationship jump-started so that they're ready when you put them out in the garden. Anyway, that's my tip for today. I'm going to be pulling some of these out and transplanting them in the next few days. Most of you have heard of hardening off on your plant seedlings before they go into the garden. And again, that reason is to keep the plant from going into shock. If you just throw them out on a bright sunny day and they've never seen sunlight, they've seen this, but this is not even at balanced at sunlight. This is a bit lower Kelvin than standard sunlight, but it's going to be higher heat and lower temperature swings at night. So you kind of transition them into that environment a few days so that they can feel it, and pull them in from the sun after a few hours, and then they have a few more hours the next day until you see them not having the wilt reflex, and that's the point where they're ready to get transplanted. So that'll happen next. Now that these plants are really raring to go and we're getting a little crowded in here, they're going to start fighting for sunlight from the lamps pretty soon. So it's time to get those out in the garden, and then they'll have a much better chance of going out because they've already started this relationship with organic living microorganisms in the soil. So anyway, that's what I just wanted to explain today, is the magic of living soil. So keep that in mind when you put compost in your seedling mix. Yes, sometimes you may have an influence of some mold spores or something that comes in, so there is a risk there. I've had damping off before, and it's really cruel because you have this beautiful little seedling coming up and then it just boop, tips over with this weak point at the base of the stem. So that's no fun. But I just wanted to explain that in the case of worm castings that came from our worm bin, that material was generated from our kitchen from 2 people over the course of the winter, and all that vegetable matter, old bread, eggshells and the like, gets processed by the worms into this wonderful, rich compost that's full of worm castings, and that's what I used in these soil blocks in the recipe. And so in this case, there isn't a mold spore, there's no mildew, there's nothing, there's no real pathogenic pressure on these plants. It's getting full nutrition, getting full growth, and it's really easy to see that with the health of these seedlings. So it can be done. There is risk if you just buy some compost from the store without knowing what's in it. So there is the awareness there, at least, that you have to keep an eye on these seedlings. One of the ways that you can minimize mildew and mold growth, of course, if you are using some purchased compost or something you're not really detailed as far as the ingredients of that compost. Things to watch out for are top watering, which is why I don't like the cells, the plastic cells, because you have to water from the top. If you can, put holes in the bottom of those cells and water them from the bottom and let it wick up from the bottom, because that reduces the amount of retained water on the surface of the plants, and that reduces the possibility of mold and mildew and damping off on the top. These are all watered from below, so I fill these once every few days now, actually once every 2 days now that they're really pumping through this water. And you just fill the tray and it wicks up from below, so you don't get the surface of the block being very wet much longer than a few minutes right when you pour it in on one side of the tray. So in the case of the compost that came from the worm bin, it was self-generated from our house from 2 people over the course of the winter. I only used a little, it's just 5 gallons in the whole recipe for the soil blocks that created 450 living seedlings here that are doing quite well. So keep that in mind. You want to be careful what you source your compost with. But if it's made on-site by you in your worm bin, and we talk about that in the program as far as getting your own worm bin going, it's a very safe way to create a nutrient-rich, microbe-active living soil to start your seedlings in. That's it for today. Thanks for joining me.